of the areas that trauma affects is the area of behavior. We are still going to look into that as well. And of course, trauma impacts your spiritual development. I know many of us may not know this, but it has a very profound impact on our spiritual life. I'm going to touch a little bit on that now. Tomorrow, we are going to delve deep into that when we begin to uncover the root of trauma and many things will happen to us. And then we'll talk about the danger of compartmentalization. Okay, so I'll touch a little bit on the impact of trauma on spiritual growth. And I'll just list about just 3 things just to convince us that trauma has impact on spiritual growth. And tomorrow we can delve into that. The first thing that trauma could impact when it comes to spiritual growth or our spiritual life is that it can cause spiritual disconnection. Trauma can lead to that feeling of abandonment or disconnection from your higher power, from your community, which could be your church or just your circle of the circle of people that you have the same belief system with. It could also impact your personal spiritual belief system. And I think I need to say this. I remember in those days, one of someone lost a sibling, and this sibling of ours happened to live with her, a young boy who was in secondary school. And this boy lived with her, and the boy committed suicide, drank sniper, and they came back, met him dead. And of course, it was a very tragic situation. They were very devastated, especially the wife, because he's a younger brother. And she reached out to me. I think I was doing a teaching on the place of the blood and all that. And then she said she has a question that, what would you say to this? I'm praying. I have a good relationship with God. And many of us, we may have the same question. And this thing happened under my roof. Not even a dream. God never told me about this. And that feeling of abandonment came in. And she told me, she said, she told God that she is no longer serving God. Now, the reason she brought that up was because when I was doing that teaching, she became convicted and she reached out and said, this is what I actually did. And she gave me the backstory to that. So you could see that spiritual disconnection from the feeling of abandonment. She felt abandoned by God, by a higher power. And that it distorted her spiritual belief. Every knowledge about God that she had gathered over the years was challenged because of this. And for a while, she distanced herself from God. And this same experience, of course, also leads us to the second experience, which could be loss of faith. Traumatic experiences may challenge or diminish an individual's faith, making it difficult to find meaning or purpose. Still using the same example, part of it is, what is now the purpose of this life? If my prayer could not even move God to give me an insight as regards a tragic event that is about to take place in my family, it's a different thing entirely if you are not praying or if you are living in sin and the likes. And because of that, it resulted or it could result in loss of faith. And eventually, which still using the same story, it could also impact this area of our life, make us feel guilty or that shame, which was the experience of this individual. By the time she reached out, she started, because I was teaching on guilty conscience, guilt and the likes, and the place of the blood and all that. And then she said, since that time, even though she had repented and confessed the Lord as his savior and is the king of, as our savior rather, and the king of our life, but that guilt was still very present. And every time she attempts to pray or do any form of spiritual activity, it will come back again. and that becomes a source of discouragement. That changed her sense of identity, giving her a distorted kind of identity that we call shame. And all this is because of a traumatic event. Remember, what the wound that event leave behind is the trauma. Trauma is not the event itself, is the scar, the wound that it leaves behind. So I'm just going to stop there as regards the impact of trauma on spiritual growth. Tomorrow we are going to delve deep into it and we'll be able to rebuild from the foundation up. Okay, so now I'm going to delve into the scientific aspects. I was a little reluctant to put the scientific aspects of this, but I feel like it is very important for us to understand this so that we can have an holistic knowledge that will enable us to approach trauma both in our lives and in the life of anyone that we are trying to support in an holistic way. And if we are able to understand the impact on the brain, it will explain some of the changes that you will notice in the psychological and the emotional life of an individual that is traumatized. It will explain the reason for some of their behaviors. It will explain what again? The reason why they sustain limiting beliefs and some of the things that you see manifest as symptoms of trauma in the lives of the victim. And some of us might be able to relate with this. And I need to tell you that um, it doesn't matter what what we said or what we've said or what we are going to say. It doesn't matter how bad it might look. There is a way out. There is total and complete recovery from trauma. So when an individual experiences a traumatic event or a distressing situation, the brain chemistry is altered and the brain began to function in a different way. And this change could affect different areas of the individual's life. Could affect the psychological and the emotional life. It could affect the behavioral life, which is the behavior. Could affect the body itself. Could see the physical impact of that. I spoke on that earlier. And I'm going to show us some pictures. I believe pictures would explain this a lot and it will give you the visual that would help us to follow along with this. The first diagram that we are looking at is actually that of the brain. I mean, it's not a perfect diagram. It's just just to drive the point in. This talks about the development of the brain. And you can see the number 1, 2, 3, and that number follows the development of the brain. The brain actually develops from the bottom up. And I'm going to share a little bit about the function of each of those areas, not all of it, but the ones that are related to what we are talking about or that trauma really affects, so that it will help us to interpret the other pictures on the next slide. Excuse me. So we see the primitive brain. This is the first part of the brain to develop. And, actually this part of the brain is active as early as you give birth to a child. And the reason why this part is very important is because this is the part that is responsible for survival. Most of the things that you do involuntarily, like breathing, like temperature, blinking of your eyes, digestion and the likes, this is the part of the brain that is responsible for that. And the second part, which we see here, the midbrain, also called the limbic area, is what I call the emotional brain. That's the part of the brain that harbors your emotion. It's the part of the brain that is responsible for attachment and emotional development. I'm going to highlight two areas in that part of the brain as we proceed that would help us on this journey of uncovering the impact of trauma. The third part is the cortical brain, and I would call it the thinking brain. The thinking brain, this is where the executive function skills takes place. It's responsible for learning, it's responsible for impulse control, is responsible for thinking and strategizing, reasoning, and all those takes place at this part of the brain. And it is interesting that this is the last part of the brain to develop, and the full development of this part is at the age of 25. You see why your 2-year-old will not reason with you when you say, stop crying, don't do this, don't do that. Is because this part of the brain is still not fully developed. So many of us, we put unnecessary burden on these children. And you see why children can be easily traumatized. And that's why I just want us to understand this, because if we have this understanding, what I do, I'm a parent myself. One of the things I do is I follow the developmental milestone of my kids. And at each point, I know what to expect. I know that at a point, they want to fight for boundaries. So everything you tell them, they will say, no, 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 no. At a point, they will say, stop. They just want to be in control, even though they don't know what it means. So when that is finding expression, I don't see them as a rebellious children. I understand that this is a phase. They are going to grow past it. Then I will learn how to support them at this phase of their life. And many of us that have kids that are teenagers already, I believe it will be helpful for us to look into this as well. What is happening within them at this time? That's the time that they are trying to uncover or discover their identity. So there will definitely be a time where there will be identity exploration, where they will explore options. And that's when we see teenagers as know-all. There are times that if parents are not careful, that you lose that place of being the strongest voice in their life. They follow different things, models on social media, peer pressure, and stuff like that, in order to find their identity, because it is in finding that identity that makes them feel like a person. They will come to the knowledge of high, but they will have to go through that exploration. So as parents, if we do not understand this phase, that's the phase we try to correct. It's not the phase for correction, it's the phase to support. What they need is not correction, because at that phase, they believe they know everything. So every attempt to correct them, it will be as though you are the enemy. And anyone that is not correcting, that is willing to build the bond and keep the line of communication open, will be their first contact every time they need an advice or they need the wisdom to navigate a certain area of their lives. So if we understand these things, it helps us, and it takes a lot of burden off our neck. You realize that many of the things you trouble about is a product of ignorance. If only you know. The same way you can plant a maize today, you won't put trouble on yourself if you wake up the next morning and it's not germinating. You know the gestational period. It won't come out until so number of days. Harvest is going to take so number of months. And because of that, in 1 week, if you are not seeing anything, it won't bother you. What changed? Knowledge. So if we can acquire this knowledge, it's going to help us to navigate, even for ourselves, to understand what is happening. There are times that you might feel like, I think I can't do this. I'm just useless. I can't, stuff like that. Maybe because you encounter a challenge or you see other people doing certain things that you are not doing. And you do not take time to study yourself and understand the uniqueness that is in you so that you can find expression. You are not created to do everything, and you can't be like anyone, just like no one can be like you. So this knowledge is actually going to go a long way when it comes to our growth and our journey through life. And if we understand that, don't forget we have the primitive brain, or you can call it the survivor brain. We have the emotional brain, and we have the thinking brain. Never forget that. Remember, I told us that in the emotional brain, there are two areas that I want to highlight that is very important. And these two areas is where you see the impact of trauma the most. These are the two areas: the hippocampus and the amygdala. The amygdala is actually wired for survival. Remember the survivor brain, if at any point, because the survivor brain is responsible to keep you alive, to ensure that you are in this part of eternity and live. So the amygdala becomes like a shield for a protector, the alarm system for the survivor brain. That if there is anything wants to, or if at any time anything wants to threaten the life of an individual, the amygdala is going to sound the alarm system. Remember, it's the shield. It wants to protect, to make sure that you are alive, to make sure that nothing happens. And I need to say this: the things that threatens life may not be an actual event. It could be a perceived threat. The amygdala doesn't care if it's perceived or it's real. It's going to kick off the alarm system. And when this alarm system is kicked off, guess what? It's hard to think rationally. It's going to shut down every other aspect and divert all attention to protect the survivor brain. And that is why, if you have ever had a conversation with someone that had gone through or experienced maybe sexual abuse, the society sometimes would say, why didn't you shout? Why didn't you call for help? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? It is the thinking brain that does that. And at this point that the threat is sensed, the thinking brain is shut down. So the person will not be able to think rationally. The person will not be able to make any positive decision at the time. I will tell you what takes place there. And some of us can understand our experiences. When this amygdala, when it's activated, I think I'm even going ahead of myself. Let me tell you about hippocampus. We'll still get there, don't worry. I'm excited about this. Maybe that's why I'm going ahead of myself. Now, the hippocampus is actually responsible for memory. Not all the memory. There's a certain kind of memory that this part of the brain is responsible for. It's called the implicit memory. We have two kinds of memory. We have the explicit memory. The explicit memory is the memory that goes deep into details. You are able to recall things. You can remember the number, the color, the arrangement, and all that. If you have ever seen maybe an accident victim, it could even be a rape victim, you realize that when you ask them to describe, they won't be able to give you a recall completely. Sometimes all they might remember might be the smell of the person's clothes. Sometimes it could be the smoke from the accident. If you ask them, how many times did the vehicle somersaulted? What did the room look like where you were raped? They might not be able to give that description, because that is the responsibility of the explicit memory. And the explicit memory happens at the thinking level. And at that time, the thinking brain is shut down. You see that? The implicit memory is an emotional memory. It's the memory that only captures the emotion, what you felt, the weight of the emotion that comes at the time of the event is what the implicit memory captures. And that's why it's just going to recall just little things. The reason for those little is to be able to store that emotion accurately. And it is this part of the brain, the hippocampus, which is for implicit memory, that is responsible to decipher if this event happened in the past or in the present. So it's this part that helps you to date and time it. You see that? Now, what happened when someone goes through a traumatic experience? I'm going to show us. Now, this is how the normal brain should respond. I don't know if we can see that. This is how the normal brain, I mean, we all go, life is full of challenges. There are situations where we feel threatened, we feel that our life is in danger, and the body will react to that. The same mechanism will happen in the brain that I showed you. But I will show you the difference when it's now trauma. Okay? When there is a perceived danger or a real danger that you could see, feel, tangible, or one you could sense, which is perception, the emotional aspect of your brain kicks to action. That's the amygdala, which is the alarm system, is going to flare up. And the moment it flares up, it's going to alert another system in the body, the hypothalamus, to release the adrenaline. The adrenaline is the flight, fight, or freeze hormone. And what adrenaline does is to prepare you for that impact. The preparation could be to energize you to run away. It could be to energize you to stay and accommodate it. It could be to energize you to fight it. Now, what determines your response? Because some of us, if you have ever been startled before, maybe someone hid behind the door and you just stepped in unknown, and the person screamed at you and you were startled, you realize that for some people, they will stretch out their hand to fight, like push away. That's the fight response. For some people, they will run back or run away. That's the flight response. For others, they will just freeze in one position. That's the freeze response. How did you come about that? Because there was nobody that questioned you if you want to choose freeze, flight, or fight. I need to tell us this. Everything happened in childhood. The first experience that endanger your life, the age that it happens can actually determine your response. Let me give you an example. An example is a baby that is crying for food, the breast milk, and the mother is so stressed. And the baby can't run away. And survival has to do with food. And because the mother is so stressed or busy doing other things, and it's like, but I just fed you now. What is happening? Why don't you? Now, what you don't know is that the brain of that child is sensing a threat to that life. And because of that, the amygdala will flare up. And because the baby is not able to run, it means adrenaline cannot prepare that child to run. Adrenaline can only prepare that child to accommodate the impact so that it will reduce the impact of what is happening to that child. And you will see the freeze response. For a mother that maybe the child still wants to breastfeed, I'm just using this as an example for us to understand. The child still wants the milk, but you are like, this is enough. I have other things to do. And you are taking the child off the milk, and the child is trying to, off the breast, and the child is trying to get back there. It's like a tussle, right? A struggle. At that time, the fight response could be the response that the child will acquire. You see that many of these things are wired. They are not default settings that we came with from heaven. They are experiences of life that we have even as early as our day one on earth that shapes the neural pathways in our brain. And this determines our reaction to situations, especially when our lives are being threatened. So, in this case, when there is a burst of adrenaline, then either of the three can happen. Fight, flight, or freeze response is activated to prepare the body in order to ensure that survival is not lost. And the moment that happens, if the threat prolongs, if it goes on for a longer time, then cortisol is going to release. It lasts longer. And if the individual, the brain sense that the threat has passed, then the parasympathetic system will kick in order to stop the release of adrenaline or cortisol so that the person can come to a normal state where there is no distress, where there is peace and unity, and still experience the normal atmosphere of love and affection that is needed. This is how the normal brain responds. This is how it responds. I remember I used to have a patient back in Nigeria who was a custom officer, and in one of his outing, when he was on duty, they had to deal with some smugglers, and the battle became so fierce that they began to shoot at each other. And when it was obvious that the smugglers, they had more weapon than the custom officers, they picked a race. This is the man himself relating these stories. He ran for, I can't remember how many meters again or kilometers. Then suddenly one of his colleagues looked at him and said, "You've been shot." That was when he looked at his chest and saw blood gushing out. He never knew there was blood gushing out. And he ran. The moment he saw the blood, he collapsed and fainted. Now, the question is, the strength he had to embark on that race was a product of adrenaline. The adrenaline prepared him, energized him to get to the place of safety before he fainted. You see how the brain works. It wants you to survive, and we do anything and everything to survive. As a matter of fact, if anything happens to you, the body can shut down every part of your body to direct the blood to the brain to keep it there, because the brain without oxygen for maybe 4 minutes is dead. That's how God designed our body to work. So the first assignment of, or the first purpose of life, rather, is survival. And we see it even according to the design of the brain. Now, in a brain that is traumatized, let me show you what happens. That brain is stuck in survival mode. It's stuck there in survival mode. Let me give you an example. An example of is someone that experienced traumatic experience like abuse or neglect, and is in that situation consistently. You see that the parent or an older person in the family that is meant to take responsibility, provide support and all for the child was not present. Could be present physically, but not emotionally present. And because of that, the sense of attachment that is a vital need for every human, I'm still going to talk on that, if not today, tomorrow, to let us know the basic needs of individual. And it is when any of these needs are not met that the body sense a threat. The body interprets it as a threat to your life. So if you find yourself in an environment where any of these needs are not met, they are not wants, they are needs, you realize that you find yourself constantly under stress. Stress that sometimes you may not even know why you are going through it, because where it's coming from is so subtle that you may not be able to pinpoint it. The environment is now your norm, it's a second nature, so you can attribute your trauma to that environment because you now grew up in it. But it doesn't mean that your brain does not recognize the fact that you are deprived of a vital need that is required for your survival. And because of this, the brain is going to stuck in a survival mode. Some of us, we live in a family where there is violence here and there, domestic violence. Raising the, you know, parents raise their voice every time. There's always fight. And at one point or the other, it's hard to just experience peace and rest. At interval, there is unrest. There is a reason to cry. There is a reason to hide. There is a reason to, many things are just happening. And because of this, your brain is stuck in survival mode. Sexual abuse, especially from someone that is within. And it is interesting that most of the sexual abuse are not first kick-started by strangers. It starts in-house. Maybe uncle, maybe step-parent, stuff like that. And some of us grew up in a culture where we don't know how to say no. Even if a stranger comes, they call the stranger your uncle. Greet your uncle. They call the stranger your auntie. Greet your auntie. Greet your mommy. Everyone is your mommy. Every male adult that comes home is your daddy. And suddenly, your perceived daddy is now touching you in a way you don't even know how to interpret it. And then when everything happens and you are traumatized, you are like, what is happening? Is it not that you are enjoying it, that you are not saying anything? No, you have confused the child. And we need to understand it, that it is very important, especially for those of us that are parents, and even those of us that are adults, that do not have the opportunity to grow up in an environment where we learn how to say no. We need to parent ourselves again. It's called reparenting. You must learn to say no. I'm going to show you the reason why it's difficult because of trauma. Because trauma also affects the impulse control system that helps you to say no and yes and all that. And that's the reason why many people could not stop from their addictive behaviors. We are going to go into that. So when you are stuck in the survival mode, you know what happened? It means your brain will shut down the thinking brain. It means the thinking brain will shrink. And this is the area that is responsible for regulation. It regulates your mood. Remember, you have the emotional brain, but the emotional brain cannot regulate itself. It's regulated by the thinking brain. So the thinking brain will shrink. So you realize that you find yourself constantly in a negative mood. And you are wondering, why is this mood swing? Why is this? You find yourself, you have, what do we call this? Self-criticism, self-hatred, and stuff like that. The thinking brain shrinks as a result of trauma so that the body can focus on survival, or the other parts of the brain can focus on survival. And now, if the threat is so overwhelming, remember the definition of a trauma is an emotional situation that is so overwhelming for the human body or human brain to cope with. What that means in practical terms is that the hippocampus, this part, your emotional brain, that is responsible for implicit memory to store an information and date it, that this is past, this is present. What it means for the brain not to be able to cope is that that information will not be stored accurately. And when it's not stored accurately, you will not know past from present. So even though the motor vehicle accident happened 10 years ago, but because of the overwhelming experience that it was, hippocampus was not able to store it accurately. So when something, maybe the smell of the smoke was the only thing that was a clue for the hippocampus to accurately store the emotions of that experience, maybe at the time that this happened, the anxiety was so much, suddenly you began to have nightmares, suddenly you couldn't sleep, you became depressed, and many other things. You became numb, dissociated, or other symptoms of trauma like that. those might be the response that took place on the day that that event took place. Now, what happened is because this part of the brain could not date it into past, present, anytime you smell a smoke, maybe you are just going through the backyard of, of a neighbor and they were doing a party and you just smell a smoke that is similar to that of that accident, it becomes a trigger. It becomes a trigger that alerts the brain as though that motor vehicle accident is happening again right now. So the same response of that day will be activated again. So I want to say this. Someone that is traumatized, one of the reasons why they find it difficult to hold down relationship, to build trust in relationship, is because they are stuck in the past. So most of the conflict in the marriage, in the relationship, if you think very well, you realize that it's not actually about what happened that you fought about. It's about the past experience. What happened just became a trigger that triggered the emotions of that day. Remember, you don't know past from present, then it brings it. And sometimes, even yourself, when you ask yourself, why was I this angry? Why was I this upset? You can't explain it. Now you have an explanation. So, because of this, of course, it means the hippocampus that is meant to store the implicit memory is also not performing up to par. So, is also going to shrink. And the attention will be on amygdala, which is going to be overactive. That's the alarm system and is constantly on high alert. So you see people that are traumatized, they are very sensitive, very sensitive. Little thing they can flare up. And many times we call it anger. And that these people have anger management issues. Think, for example, someone that had experienced maybe separation or divorce, and now in another marriage. The experience of that past divorce or separation is still there. It was a traumatic experience. As a matter of fact, I don't know because I've never experienced this. They said the trauma of divorce is worse than the trauma of death. I don't know how true that is, but obviously it's very traumatic. Now, think about it. Something very small now came up with your new spouse, with your new partner. And you wonder why you got angry that much. It's not about what came up. It's about the wound that the traumatic experience of the past left behind. And as long as that wound is not attended to, because many a times we live in denial, we don't admit. And the first step to recovery is to come to that place where we acknowledge and accept the pain. If we have not gotten to that place, we can't move forward. That's the first step. And you won't get to that place until you follow our quote, curiosity. It brings you to that place where you explore self and ask questions. And also to that place where you are willing to let go of the ideas that no longer serve you. We are still going to go deep into that. I just want to bring perspective to that. So you see what is happening now. The individual is taught in survival mode. And this is what we call trauma. So you see it affects the emotions. Suddenly, that little thing, you suddenly realize, why are you crying like this? Is it not this and that? I was listening to a story, was it yesterday, of a couple. The woman was just relating an experience that happened, I don't know how long ago, when there was like a misunderstanding between herself and the husband, and it was like a verbal war. And the husband walked out. And she was following the husband on the street saying, we need to talk about this, we need to talk about this, and all that. And the husband said she should go back home, she shouldn't follow her. or follow him rather. And she kept following. So the husband had to call the mother of the wife's mother. And the mother spoke to her daughter that go back home. And then she made a very profound statement. She said, if I go back, he may not come back again. Now, you realize that the reason why she was doing that was not because she suddenly wanted to become a woman that nags. It was because of a traumatic experience that resulted into a wound that she's yet to overcome or to heal from. And then she said this. He said when she made that statement, the husband turned back and said, I'm coming back home. It was at that point that she was able to turn back and go back home. Now, you could give her any kind of name, but you cannot deny the fact that the problem was not that she was stubborn. uh, she was just, you can call it whatever you want, is it was a trauma response. You see that? And she may have not come to that point, because I can't even remember if she mentioned anything trauma, but she may have not come to that point where she realized that it was actually a trauma response. And if that happens again, you will be surprised that the response will be the same over and over. Because every time the trigger comes, your thinking brain is suspended. You can't make a rational decision. Every decision you will make is emotional, and it will be a product of the memory, the implicit memory that your emotional brain stored from the traumatic event. You see that? So if we understand that, then we can move forward. On this slide, I mentioned the other areas that trauma could impact.